Hello, and welcome back to our conversation series with Hayden White. I'm Ethan Kleinberg, professor of history and letters at Wesleyan University and executive editor of History and Theory. And next to me is Hayden White, professor emeritus at UC Santa Cruz and Stanford University. And we're discussing his most recent book, The Practical Past, which came out with Northwestern University Press. So in this session, I'd like to talk a little bit about form. And in particular, the relation of the forms of traditional disciplinary historical writing to the sorts of writing you see at work in what you call the practical past. But first I have a question, because I'm wondering, is it writing or written artifacts that helps us reach our practical past, or is that just one example of artifacts, moods that allow us to have this? Literature is certainly privileged in your book, but the ways we understand the past and the way the past forms us in a practical sense, these seem myriad. So I'm wondering about the status of literature, whether this is a privileged category for this practical past, or whether it's one of many pieces that are at play.
Writing is a special kind of case for me because I'm a cultural historian. And I regard literary writing as a paradigm of cultural productivity, as a paradigm that I can use for set over against other kinds of writing that do not so prominently feature their literariness.
Right.
So this is why when I'm talking about tropes and tropology, I use literary works, because that's where I can find good examples of it. The idea is this will give you some idea of how these tropes can be identified in non-literary writing.
So let me deploy Paul Roth's question. Paul Roth, who's professor of philosophy at UC Santa Cruz, sent in a question that's ultimately, I think, interested in issues of moral substance, but I would like to push it more in this direction of form in thinking about your response. So he asks, I begin by noting that your own models for narrative innovation invariably draw on works of literature. Is this because you think that no one has written in recent memory something like a practical history of the sort for which you lobby? In this regard, how would you classify works such as Browning's Ordinary Men or Novik's That Noble Dream, works that I at least would nominate as having important lessons to teach, but which do not obviously answer any Kantian call to guide agents in their moral behavior? Do works such as these suggest that you offer something of a false dilemma? Either one does practical history in your sense, or one produces histories drained of all moral substance.
First of all, Christopher Browning's book is a good example of standard history. It has moral implications because it's about how what he calls ordinary men found themselves in a situation where they did extraordinary things like killing children and so forth. This was a police squad or brigade that was militarized and was given the job of shooting Jewish prisoners in a number of towns in Poland. He recounts this. It's difficult to say what effect he wants. He doesn't read moral lessons. He shows us ordinary men under conditions of stress doing these horrible things. Now, from a standpoint of a philosopher, I have to ask, well, it turns out if a person is what they do, these are not ordinary men.
Right.
Or they are ordinary men, and what you say they did has to be put in the category of ordinary too, thus revising our conception of ordinary.
So on that logic, the ordinary is pretty terrible.
That's right, which many people feel it is.
Yes.
The other book that I like by Browning, the one I really like, is called Remembering Survival. In this one, he undertakes to nail a Nazi officer who has been exonerated by the German courts, even though the evidence is overwhelmingly shows that he's guilty of these crimes. I mean, he says, I'm angry that this guy escaped, and I'm going to get him. And he does, without a shadow of a doubt, prove this guy. In the process, he points out that in German courts, the victims are not allowed to testify because the thought is, since they've been victimized, they're not objective.
Right. So this is interesting because the role of the historian is different in a way than the judiciary, but it's certainly judicial. The historian actually has access to documents and things that are inadmissible in courts in a way to pronounce a certain kind of judgment. Of course, this doesn't sound objective at all. It sounds prosecutorial.
Yes, it is prosecutorial. And this is the basis for all of those people who say, well, the historian's like a detective. He's trying to find out who committed the crime and so forth. And that's true in many cases. Historians undertake to find out who done it, right? But that isn't the only thing they're doing. And secondly, you can only carry the analogy so far because in most historical cases, the subject is dead, so he can't be interrogated. Secondly, you don't have the equivalent of a jury. And as in a jury trial, you can decide, okay, all the evidence is in, you have to reach a decision. And you have,
wouldn't you say the reader could serve the function of the jury?
True.
The reader is convinced by the summation. Well, certainly there's a difference between the legal and the good. That's always been the case.
But that should be part of what we're imparting to our undergraduate students. In other words, in the history department, a student takes a class in history, undergraduate. You're not teaching him to become a historian. You're teaching him to think historically as one part of the whole process of rendering a judgment on things that you have to render judgment on in the course of your daily life.
So let's use that to move to the example of Friedlander's book, because Friedlander's book is an attempt to write this history, and one that sort of purports to allow the voices to speak for themselves, but certainly it wants to lead the reader to a certain moral judgment at the end. I'll read Carolyn Dean's from Yale, her question on this, and then we can press into it. She says, is it plausible that in Friedlander's work there is more tension than you allow for between the desire for a stable historical narrative and the desire to upend any such thing? You say the reviews confuse narration with narrative, and this may be true, but why do you believe the book was so easily misread and embraced if it was ultimately so radical in form and substance? Even Richard Evans, who found it literary, saw no difference between mainstream historiographical accounts of the Holocaust and Friedlander's, except that Friedlander's was better because it was literary. So let's look into that. Let's look into that question. The chilling normality presented as through a realist narrative, but one that's interrupted and broken up by the voices of the victims.
One of the things I purported to show was this notion of raw voices of the victims is a rhetorical statement. I show that quoting a source is not a raw voice when I can demonstrate that the passage being quoted is highly crafted. It's not something that is concurrent with the event.
Yes. It's staged.
It's a report.
Yes.
It's a report. And not only that, it's a report that has many identifiable rhetorical and literary features in order to get the effect of rawness.
Yeah, I've often, you cite Benjamin when discussing it in your chapter, and I've thought It reminds me of the sort of the Benjaminian fantasy of the book that's sewn together of passages from other books.
Right.
And so in the one, it's the feint of a kind of, oh, it was already said and it's definitive because it's not me. But of course, it's precisely the craftsmanship of sewing those passages together to an effect that wasn't the effect of the originals and to an end.
Right.
And when I read Friedlander's book, it's precisely the way these are crafted and punctuated, always to my mind, to moral effect.
Sure.
So that the objective historical account is then put in relief against what you know to be the moral reality of the work.
Exactly. In fact, I tried to point out that these quotations that he uses from a very limited number of sources have the effect of allowing him to get into his discourse the moral outrage that he himself feels without having to say this. Well, here is what this young man wrote on the eve of his being carried off to the ghetto or something like that. Here's what he wrote, and it's poignant. He doesn't have to say this is how I felt, or he was justified in this. He doesn't have to make it a part of it. It's not an argument. It's not a part of the argument. It's not even a part of the explanation, the larger explanation of what caused the Holocaust, about which he has a theory that he's laid out in a separate.
But it does end up serving the purpose of evidence to substantiate the argument.
Evidence of what is the point?
Well,
not of the raw voice.
Not of the raw voice, but of the moral outrage, or in fact, the way this goes contrary to what we should think.
And the confusion.
Yeah,
Of
and that's important
confronted
too.
with these things.
So that's the question of being able to get to possibles that were unimaginable at a certain time, that now, because of precisely those historical events, we in a way take for granted from our position in the present.
Yeah.
So do you see this as an example of a work that actually is able to access, to manipulate, to move this practical past? I mean, on which side do you put it, or on both?
There are a couple of things. One, he says that he does not want to give, he wants to narrate. He does not want to make it a simple, straightforward story. He wants to break it up.
Yes.
He wants to de-narrativize it. He says that.
Yes. How would you put Friedlander's work into conversation with Sebald's work, for instance? You sort of have these, it's not chiastic, but this twinning effect between the chapter where you use Sebald and the one where you discuss Friedlander.
Friedlander has a fear of fictionalization. I have a quotation in one of the essays I wrote on him in which he says, any hint of fiction will destroy the authority of the witness. Any hint, he says, any whisper of fiction. I think that, I say exactly, this is why I want to distinguish between literary writing and literature understood as fiction. Not all literary writing is fictional. An account of factual material cast in a literary mode will produce a different effect from one that purports to be plain language, non-literary.
This is an interesting point, because part of what interests you in the practical past is precisely the moral lessons to be learned, and part of the academic allergy to rhetoric goes back to Plato and this distinction between rhetoric, which can be used to any purpose, and philosophy, which is ultimately interested in the good,
exactly,
which would be the moral position. And so one thing that would be interesting to hear you articulate is the way that the rhetoric and the rhetorical, to your mind, actually takes the position of leading us to the moral or the good along the way, which would be a contradiction to certainly the way most things are taught through the Platonic tradition.
You cannot, I mean, Hume, I thought that any educated person would know of Hume's demolition of the possibility of deducing a moral position from a state of objective, a statement of fact. You can't deduce ought from is. Now, if you don't learn that in philosophy, you're going to be on the wrong path forever. You can, however, narrativistically derive a moral from a story that has been told, because the connections are not those of logical deduction, but of tropological displacements and condensations. So you can, by successive redescriptions of a phenomenon, or the removal of it to another place and redescribing, you can gradually build into it the components that call for a moral judgment. In other words, I think that what I call the practical past is best approached by the kind of thinking that is called, in a technical sense, deliberative. Deliberative and heuristic rather than logical and scientific. But the only reason I studied it was because I was interested in ethical education. And you're not going to get that in the sciences. And you're not going to get it in most of the social sciences insofar as they aspire
To be sciences in the hard sense.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question that Michael Roth just sent me. He says, choice remains fundamental in your work. You write about 19th century historians and philosophers choosing the form of their narratives or their modes of implotment. More recently, you have written about choosing one's past instead of discovering one's past. He asks, who is making this choice? What kind of subjectivity or subject do you imagine as capable of choosing in this way?
Well, it's a Western subject to begin with. The Western subject that labors under the idea that in order to be true to yourself, you have to contrive a persona that is totally consistent, your ethics with your knowledge, your ethics with your practice, your early life with your later life.
So this is a narrative construction
Yeah.
here. At other moments, I had the sense that you weren't entirely convinced that our mode of being is a narrative mode in the sense that, say, David Carr presents it.
Well, not in the sense of David Carr. What I say is you can try to live a narratively coherent life, but actually you can't live such a life because death is there. Because all the lives end in the same way.
Yes.
So that there's no invention at the end to get you out of that condition. But David Carr thinks that there are lived stories, and that institutions may live these stories. I would say that this is what Flaubert and Cervantes is making fun of, that idea. Emma Bovary wants to live the life of a romantic heroine, and that's what gets her
Right.
fucked.
Well, I mean, one could argue that you are, certainly with Don Quixote, whether or not you can live a certain narrative is historically contingent. You can't be a knight errant in a time when there are none, and you can't be of a certain class if you're not of a certain class. At different times,
That's
right? And so it isn't necessarily the narrative that's the problem there, it's being out of time.
But this whole business of there being lived stories, or that I would think that anyone that tried to live a particular story form, by which I mean a story with a plot and with all the elements of agency and self-awareness and so forth of a literary hero or protagonist of a novel, anyone try to do that's crazy. And this is why I think that there's a certain kind of therapy that works on getting a person to change the story that they've been living with that's been given to them by others.
Well, certainly as it becomes social history, it leads to a new kind of stability and reification of who counts as a historical subject that sort of is at odds with the instability of the moment of rupture. And I'm wondering whether something like the practical past conserves that sense of rupture, or does it reify the stability of what or who counts?
Well, I think that the notion of the practical past is useful for writing the history of unstable democracies, where you want a wider array of agents, and a different kind of agent, the subaltern. Women. Remember how difficult it became. The male historians thought that if you wanted to have women in history, they could be there either as Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen, who plays the role of a man.
Politically important.
Or Joan of Arc or someone like that. But the history of women in general would only be possible if you sort of added women and stir. But you keep the same form, you keep the same form, same format, same research agenda, just add women. Well, my argument was that if you want to revolutionize a given mode of doing history, like, for example, I'm getting a lot of stuff sent to me about queer history. And the people who write to me mean this in two senses. Telling the history of queers, or, well, calling them queers rather than gay, is already a move, a significant move for re-describing what's going on. Or they mean a history itself that is queer.
Yes.
And I've seen some interesting experimentations of that.
And the notion of queer time seems prevalent in this movement of queering time, of pointing out the strangeness of the mechanisms.
Well, see, I believe that in an age of literacy, the ideology is contained in the form of the discourse rather than in the factual content.
So on that, let me ask you a question, because this is something I've thought about a lot. Do you think that metahistory and the works that followed it may have come too soon, in a sense that at that moment we certainly were still in a publishing atmosphere that was restricted by the form of the codex or the manuscript, the journal article, in a way that wouldn't allow for experimentation that perhaps our current moment, as we've moved into digital venues that are much more accommodating to visual arts, to inserting other kinds of material, or even developing narratives that are multiple, splitting, allow for fragmentation, ways that actually can break through what I've called this analog ceiling to allow us to access these new ways of viewing, new forms that may actually break through the assumptions about the past that were fused.
Yeah. I think we've finally come into the era of the image in a way that that makes photography premature. It came to it took a long time to assimilate or accommodate potentialities of photography, and then of cinema, and now of post-cinema. Animation, for example, stuff like that. So I don't know where the metahistory was that. I'm surprised. I was only trying to do at that time a structuralist analysis of 19th century classical, historical, and philosophy of history. It was a structural analysis. I thought, no one had tried that before, I thought, which means you have to be very self-conscious about the selection of the items you're going to deal with. And I said, okay, from a structuralist standpoint, 4 items will do. which four will it be? Well, I'll pick the ones that the Guild has designated as classic. And they say, well, don't you think you need a larger sample? I gave reasons for why I didn't think that. Now, they can disagree with that or not, but I would like to ask them, what is an adequate sample of anything?
Of anything.
Yeah. Now and that's the sort of thing that we might be wanting to teach our undergraduates and our graduates about the nature of the sample. I mean, I just recently, 2 or 3 people working on their dissertations, and one guy who's an accomplished historian, he says, well, I got all these note cards and everything, and he said, I can't bring myself to start writing. And I said, well, why don't you declare that you've got enough and write write a history of events that you've got in your note cards.
It's as good a way as any to limit the field.
Yeah, exactly. And but that's a question that we all face. How long should it be? Your student asks, right? Does it have to be more than a page? You know.
So often, the research allows us to avoid the writing.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
But I'm going to use this discussion of limits to put one on our second conversation here, and then when we take up again, we'll try and press into some of these issues of ethics and morals that came up in this discussion. So let's sign off for the moment, and then we'll continue soon.
Okay.
Thank you, Hayden.
Right. Righto.